May 12, 2015, Amtrak Train 188 departs Washington, D.C. on schedule. It's heading north at nearly full capacity, 243 people on board. The weather is clear, the rails are dry. The journey appears routine. But by 9:21 p.m., the train is accelerating through Philadelphia, past 100 miles per hour. It's headed straight toward a sharp curve with a posted limit of 50. Seconds later, it leaves the tracks. This is the story of one of the most preventable train disasters in modern U.S. history, and how the technology that could have saved everyone was just weeks away from activation. Train 188 was a familiar sight to East Coast commuters. A daily service running from Washington, D.C. to New York City, it moved through some of the most congested and historically significant tracks in the country, the Northeast Corridor. This stretch is Amtrak's crown jewel, a high-speed, electrified route that handles over 2,000 trains per day. But nestled within its network was a curve with a dangerous legacy. Frankfort Junction, a sharp left-hand bend just outside downtown Philadelphia. Known to engineers for one critical number, 50 miles per hour. Exceed it, and you risk leaving the rails. Train 188 was led by a Siemens ACSS 64, City's Sprinter, a modern electric locomotive built for speed and safety. Behind it, 7 Amfleet passenger cars, sleek, aluminum-bodied coaches filled with business travelers, college students, and families returning home. At the controls was Brandon Bastian, 32 years old, a quiet, meticulous engineer with no history of safety violations. He was rested, sober, focused, and he was passionate about train safety, so much so that he had posted online several times about a specific system he believed could prevent deadly accidents. That system? It wasn't active on this stretch of track. Not yet. So how did everything still go so wrong? Just after 9:18 p.m., Train 188 passed through North Philadelphia at roughly 70 miles per hour, normal for that section. But nearby, something unusual had occurred. A SEPTA commuter train operating ahead on a different track had been hit by a projectile, possibly a rock, maybe something metallic. The train's windshield shattered. The engineer was shaken. Emergency radio chatter filled the airwaves, warning of possible attacks or other interference. The messages weren't entirely clear. Engineer Bastian was likely monitoring those reports. He may have been trying to locate the SEPTA train or decipher where the threat was. The radios crackled. The location markers passed by. At this moment, Bastian likely made a mistake. He believed he had already passed Frankfort Junction. That meant, in his mind, the speed restriction was behind him. He moved the throttle forward, accelerating out of what he believed was a danger zone. But he was wrong. The curve wasn't behind him. It was just ahead. Within seconds, the train speed shot from 70 to 80, then to 100. By the time the event recorder logged its final reading, Amtrak 188 was traveling at 106 miles per hour. Frankfort Junction's limit was 50. That curve was never designed for speed. It was a remnant of 19th century rail design, grandfathered into modern operations. It had no margin for error. Even at 60, engineers felt it. At 106, physics would have no mercy. The onboard recorder captured the final moments. Throttle wide open, speed surging, brakes applied at the last possible second. But physics had already decided the outcome. At 106 miles per hour, there would be no correction, only consequence. But this was no act of sabotage, no mechanical failure. The danger had already been sealed the moment the throttle advanced, past the point of no return. Just seconds later, steel would scream against steel, aluminum would buckle, and in the dark, at the heart of one of America's busiest cities, the train left the tracks. At 9:21 p.m., just outside the heart of Philadelphia, Amtrak Train 188 hit Frankfurt Curve at over 100 miles per hour. The steel wheels beneath the locomotive began to lift. The lead car lurched sideways, and then, impact. A violent shudder tore through the train as the first car came off the rails. The second buckled inward. Passenger coaches slammed into each other with crushing force. One flipped onto its side, another tore through a metal signal tower. The third crumpled against a pole, its frame twisted like soft aluminum. Within seconds, Train 188 transformed from a sleek commuter link into a jagged wreck of mangled steel and shattered glass. The derailment was over in 3 seconds. The wreckage was catastrophic. 6 of the 7 passenger cars had derailed, several laying sideways or overturned across the gravel. Power lines dangled above the wreck like torn wires in a storm. Twisted rail ties were thrown across the ground, and the locomotive, immense and still partially upright, sat eerily still. The violent stop had left the interior of the train in chaos. Overhead bins collapsed. Seats were ripped from their bolts. Emergency lighting flickered, then failed. And inside those shattered cars, silence. Then the sound of voices. Passengers stumbled through darkness, injured and disoriented. Some screamed for help. Others cried out the names of loved ones. One man crawled across broken glass, trying to reach a fellow traveler pinned beneath the wreckage. Another, covered in soot and blood, forced open an emergency window and pulled 2 others to safety. It was, by all accounts, a scene of utter devastation. 8 people died that night. Among them were a Naval Academy midshipman, a rising tech entrepreneur returning from a conference, a banker, a college dean, fathers, daughters, friends on their way home. More than 200 others were injured, some critically, many permanently. The people on board Train 188 weren't strangers to one another by the end of that night. They were survivors of one of the deadliest rail disasters in recent U.S. history. Within minutes of the crash, 911 calls overwhelmed dispatchers. Train off the tracks near Frankfurt. People are hurt. Really bad. Multiple cars flipped. Send everyone. Philadelphia's emergency services mobilized instantly. Fire trucks raced toward the scene. Ambulances staged in nearby intersections. Police cordoned off the crash site. First responders arrived to a nightmare lit by floodlights and chaos. They moved through wreckage with stretchers and crowbars, using hydraulic tools to pry open doors that no longer existed. Every second mattered. In some cars, passengers were still pinned and bleeding. In others, survivors were already climbing down into the gravel, dazed and barefoot, unable to understand what had happened. The wounded were taken to local hospitals. Some rushed into trauma bays with no ID, no name, just numbers pinned to their clothing. For hours, families called local news stations, desperate to find out who had survived. At sunrise, smoke and dust still hung over the Frankfurt Junction curve. That morning, the NTSB arrived. Federal investigators in blue windbreakers combed through the scene, walking the rails with notepads, cameras, and and grim expressions. They documented twisted steel, measured distances, marked the positions of each car, and most critically, they recovered the train's black box, the onboard event recorder. By mid-morning, the first clue emerged. The train had entered the curve at 106 miles per hour. There was no sign of braking until the final few seconds, far too late. Brandon Bastian, the engineer, had survived. He'd suffered a concussion, memory loss, and multiple injuries. When interviewed, he told investigators that he remembered the SEPTA train being struck. He remembered radio chatter about the incident. But the moment of acceleration, the fatal decision, was gone. He claimed he had no recollection of pushing the throttle forward, no memory of the curve, just fragments, static. And then, the crash. Toxicology reports came back clean. No alcohol, no drugs, no texts, no phone calls, no distractions logged by his devices. No failure in the train systems. The brakes worked. The controls functioned. The equipment was operational. He had accelerated. He just didn't know why. The headlines said it all. Amtrak train derails in Philadelphia. Speeding likely caused fatal crash. 8 dead, hundreds injured. But behind those headlines were deeper questions. Why wasn't there a system in place to stop the train? And if this had happened before, what had changed since? The wreckage was being cleared. The investigations were underway. But one thing was already clear. This wasn't just about one engineer's mistake. The speed wasn't in question. The evidence was clear. Train 188 entered Frankfurt Junction at 106 miles per hour, more than double the limit. The engineer didn't apply the brakes until just seconds before the curve. But as investigators combed through the wreckage, another question emerged. Why didn't the system stop the train? Because such a system existed, and it was designed for this exact scenario. It's called positive train control, or PTC, and it wasn't turned on. Positive train control is one of the most significant safety technologies in modern rail history. It's not a physical brake lever or a safety net you can see. It's a digital brain. Using GPS, real-time data, and track sensors, PTC constantly monitors a train's position, speed, and movement. If the train is going too fast or heading toward danger, it automatically intervenes. It slows the train. If the engineer doesn't respond, it brakes. In other words, it would have stopped train 188 before it ever reached Frankfurt Curve. PTC had been in development for years, and its rollout was already underway across the country. But on May 12, 2015, just days before it was scheduled to go live in that very section, PTC wasn't active in Philadelphia. The system was installed. It just hadn't been tested and certified yet. The difference between almost ready and active? 8 lives. To federal investigators, the conclusion was unambiguous. The crash of train 188 was entirely preventable. If positive train control had been active that night, the train's onboard systems would have warned Bastian, slowed the train, and overridden his throttle input. But it wasn't there. The NTSB laid out the timeline in its final report. They determined that the engineer likely became disoriented after hearing the SEPTA train incident and lost track of his location. Believing he had passed the curve, he accelerated. It wasn't recklessness. It wasn't intentional. It was a fatal misjudgment, one the system should have caught. PTC existed precisely to correct human error before it became a catastrophe. But the public wanted more than a technical explanation. They wanted accountability. In the months that followed the crash, Brandon Bostian was charged with multiple counts of involuntary manslaughter and reckless endangerment. His defense? He wasn't criminally negligent. He made a mistake, a deadly one, but not a crime. The charges were dismissed, then reinstated, then dismissed again. No conviction was ever made. Civil suits, however, led to Amtrak paying $265 million in settlements. At the time, the largest sum ever awarded for a train crash in the United States. But even as the legal battles played out in courtrooms, the bigger reckoning was unfolding in Congress. For years, the rail industry had resisted mandatory deadlines for positive train control. Implementation was expensive, complex, and politically unpopular. But the crash of Train 1888 changed everything. Public pressure mounted. Investigators testified before Congress. The media called it a national failure. By the end of 2015, PTC was fully active on the Northeast Corridor, including the stretch where Train 188 derailed. Soon after, deadlines were enforced nationally. Today, virtually every major U.S. passenger rail line is equipped with PTC, a system pushed over the finish line by the tragedy in Philadelphia. In the months after the crash, Amtrak quietly restored service along the same stretch of track. The damage was repaired, the curve reopened, and for many passengers, the memory faded. But for the families of the 8 who died, the memory of that night is permanent. They remember loved ones lost not because of a storm, not because of a terrorist attack, but because of something far more frustrating: a delay, a misstep, a piece of life-saving technology just not ready in time. Train 188 should have made it to New York that night. It had the right crew, the right passengers, and even the right technology. Almost. It was a routine journey until it wasn't. A perfect train, running perfectly, until human error met an unforgiving curve, and the system meant to stop it was still waiting for approval. If there's one lesson from the tragedy of Train 1888, it's this: the systems that save lives don't work until they're turned on.